I used to think the most painful thing at work was being fired, after giving nearly a lifetime of skill to a system I built with my own hands. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was watching people stare straight at me. Reduce that work to a faceless expense line. And honestly believe that canceling my contract meant they could also take what had kept their empire alive for years. They fired me on what looked like an ordinary morning. By noon, they understood exactly how expensive that mistake was. The email arrived at 7:23 on a Tuesday morning. Right when I was sitting alone at my kitchen table with one hand around a warm cup of coffee and the other scrolling through the overnight production reports I had reviewed every single morning for 4 straight years. Everything on the screen was green. All 12 facilities were running smoothly. No lines were out of sync. No quality checkpoints were flashing warnings. And nothing looked unusual enough to make me tense up. That was why the subject line hit so hard: immediate contract termination effective today. I did not feel anger first. I felt cold. The kind of cold that slides down your back when you realize someone has just tried to pull your chair out from under you. The message itself was so short it felt insulting. Diana, following a comprehensive operational review, we are terminating your consulting agreement effective immediately. Transition meeting scheduled for 10 o'clock this morning. Please bring all system documentation. Victor Harrington, CEO. That was it. No explanation. No thank you. Not even the courtesy of pretending to respect the person who had kept their entire manufacturing network stable for 4 years. I sat there quietly for a long moment. Not because I was too shocked to think, but because I was old enough to know, emails like that are never truly sudden. They are the final product of private conversations, budget sheets with red circles on them, and ambitious people convincing themselves that anything can be transferred if they apply enough authority. I set my coffee down. Read it again. And then a third time. With every pass, it became clearer that they were not just ending a contract. They were testing whether they could take the thing I built without paying what it was actually worth. And right then, I understood that the 10 o'clock meeting was never going to be a handoff. It was going to be the moment an overconfident man learned the difference between paying to use a system and truly owning it. My name is Diana Mercer. I am 57 years old. And most of my adult life has been tied to the kind of work people only notice when it stops industrial automation. I did not enter this field through glossy networking events or polished management language. I learned it in the middle of motors, sensors, conveyor lines, relays, long shifts, and the kind of real consequences that never care about executive slogans. I started out at North Star Aerospace and learned the trade from live production environments, real equipment, and mistakes that actually mattered. Then the crisis of 2008 came through like a knife. People who had been described as essential were cut loose after a handful of meetings. That day taught me something no business school explains. Honestly, a company may depend on you for years and still remove you the second someone believes experience can be replaced with confidence. I did not stay down for long. I went independent. Because if I was going to carry responsibility for systems complex enough to paralyze entire operations when they failed, I wanted ownership of my work to remain in my own hands. My first custom build as an independent contractor was finished in 2011 for a parts manufacturer in the Midwest. After that, word spread the way it always does in this line of work. I was not famous because I marketed myself well. I was called because I fixed problems other people could not solve, and built systems that could survive real-world pressure. In manufacturing, reputation does not come from presentations. It comes from being the person people call when the line is down and everyone else has already failed. That is why Victor's decision did not make me feel small. It reminded me of an old lesson. Corporate loyalty is fragile. Executive certainty is often shallow. And the people who underestimate technical ownership usually end up paying to relearn what they should have understood from the beginning. 4 years earlier, Harrington Manufacturing called me on another tense morning. The man on the phone was Samuel Whitmore, their chief operating officer, and I could hear exhaustion in his voice before he even finished introducing himself. He did not open with polished language about strategic partnerships. He told me plainly that the company was slipping into chaos. They had failed 3 quality audits in less than half a year. Regulators were beginning to ask questions about manufacturing permits. Their production lines were running at mismatched speeds. Quality data did not match the reality on the floor, and inventory was being tracked through patchwork, spreadsheets, and guesswork. I drove to their main facility the next morning. One walk through the plant told me everything. Each department was living inside its own island. Production had one system. Quality had another. Inventory had another. None of them truly talked to one another. And the data clashing between them was making everyone work half-blind. Every shift change cost them hours, because nobody could say with confidence what was actually happening across the floor. The smell of overheated equipment, rushed adjustments, and institutional confusion was everywhere. I stood there listening to supervisors describe their workarounds and felt a very familiar instinct settle in. This was not optimization. It was surgery. If you have ever seen a place where everything still looks active on the surface while the structure underneath is breaking apart. Comment number 1. I know that feeling well. Samuel did not try to make the situation sound prettier than it was. He asked me one clean question: could I help them regain control? When someone who has spent real time in real operations asks like that, I hear honesty, not desperation. So I said yes. Even though I already knew it would not be a quick fix. This would be a full rebuild, not a cosmetic patch. And it would demand discipline from leadership as much as it demanded engineering from me. It took me 18 months to build Harrington Manufacturing, a system that was truly theirs in function without ever becoming theirs in ownership. I did not drop an off-the-shelf platform into their plants and force their operation to bend around someone else's design limitations. I started with the ground truth. I watched each machine cycle, each line accelerate and stall, each point where operators had learned to intervene manually because the old software was wrong more often than it was helpful. I designed integration protocols around the actual timing patterns of their equipment, so the system did not just collect data. It understood the rhythm of the plant. I connected quality sensors directly into production controls, so bad runs would be recognized before they became full-scale waste. I rebuilt inventory tracking in real time, so components could be followed through the process instead of disappearing into editable spreadsheets and verbal assumptions. The hardest part was not the coding or the electrical work. It was creating an architecture strong enough to hold the reality of manufacturing and the demands of compliance at the same time. Once it went live, the difference was immediate. Quality failures stopped repeating. Bottlenecks dropped. Maintenance stopped being pure firefighting because the system began identifying trouble before it became downtime. Regulatory visits that had once terrified them became almost uneventful. What made working with Samuel bearable was that he understood exactly what he was paying for. He knew the difference between renting the use of a high-value system and taking ownership of the intellectual property behind it. That clarity made everything cleaner. The scope was clear. The boundaries were clear. The expectations were clear. When a client respects the actual nature of technical work, the relationship can become rare and straightforward. That was what made the later collapse so revealing. It showed how quickly stability can be undone when the next leader walks in and mistakes order for something automatic. My contract with Harrington Manufacturing was not the kind of document a person could skim and sign without understanding. It was written from hard experience. From years of watching, companies try to turn specialized technical knowledge into internal property through vague wording and executive pressure. I had learned too much to let that happen again. So the language was explicit. The company received an operational license. They had the right to run the system for their manufacturing purposes. Use the interface. Access approved functions. Request support. And expand within the limits of the agreement. But the source code, coordination logic, system architecture, control boards, communication protocol, and core infrastructure all remained exclusively mine. That was not greed. That was reality. The system existed because of my design judgment, my engineering labor, and the kind of accumulated experience that cannot be separated neatly from the person who developed it. Samuel read every page and signed without hesitation because he understood the difference between leasing a house and walking away with the owner's deed. For 4 years after that, the relationship was almost textbook. Monthly payments arrived on time. Performance stayed flawless. Most months, I received only a few short calls about capacity increases or new equipment integration. Nobody pushed past the contract. Nobody played games with language. It was the kind of working relationship every serious engineer hopes for: practical, respectful, and grounded in the understanding that stability is built, not gifted. If you believe intellectual work deserves real protection from the start, like the video, too many people only learn that after someone has already tried to take what they created. I had learned early enough to turn every hard lesson into contract language. And on the morning, Victor decided to terminate me. Those dry legal clauses were the only thing standing between my work and a company that suddenly believed it could claim ownership by force of attitude alone. The real trouble began the moment Samuel retired. From that point on, I had an uneasy feeling, like hearing a machine that normally runs smooth suddenly develop a faint vibration somewhere deep inside. 3 weeks later, Victor Harrington arrived with a prestigious MBA, an easy smile, and a mandate to optimize operating expenses. People like Victor walk into stable systems and view them through budget lines instead of consequences. To him, my monthly fee was not the cost of maintaining the infrastructure that kept 12 facilities synchronized. It was a number on a spreadsheet waiting to be reduced. His first email to me was not an introduction. It was a block of corporate language about vendor expense analysis and reducing external dependence. I read it once and understood immediately. I responded professionally and attached the contract along with 4 years of performance data. I thought at the very least the results might slow him down. They did not. Less than 2 hours later, he replied that he needed full documentation for an internal evaluation of operational systems. That phrase alone told me everything I needed to know. Nobody who truly understands industrial control talks about it that way, especially when they have not yet grasped the difference between a user dashboard and the infrastructure underneath it. Victor was not trying to understand the agreement. He was probing boundaries to see how far he could push before anyone stopped him. And once a new executive begins treating legal limits like negotiable inconveniences, conflict becomes only a matter of time. I was not angry yet. I was observing. Pressure was building inside the pipe. Sooner or later, something was going to burst. 4 days later, Victor sent another request, more polished in wording and more brazen in purpose. A full system architecture package for internal transition assessment. By then the mask was off. He wanted the map of the thing I had built, hoping his internal people could somehow lift me out of the picture while keeping the system alive. I answered in one clean sentence. I would happily provide everything included under the current license agreement. Calm words. Sharp boundary. After sending the reply, I walked into my garage and opened the steel cabinet that housed the master control hardware I had designed specifically for Harrington manufacturing. To anyone else, it would have looked like a heavy gray box. To me, it was the heart of the entire network. Inside were custom boards, dedicated communication circuits, logic layers for production coordination, inventory synchronization, quality integration, and equipment diagnostics. Every wire, relay, and control pathway had been assembled around the unique operational reality of their plants. Victor assumed my system was software sitting on company servers. He had only seen the surface and convinced himself he understood the depth. What he wanted was not a file transfer. He wanted to take ownership of experience that had already been translated into physical infrastructure and operational logic. Standing there in front of that cabinet, I felt strangely calm. Anger does not make me sharper. Clarity does. I knew exactly what I had built, exactly what I owned, and exactly what he was underestimating. At that point, this was no longer just a contract disagreement. It had become a test of whether real engineering discipline would bow to executive arrogance wrapped in polished vocabulary. 3 days after that, Victor sent yet another email, this time asking for written confirmation that all automation software belonged to Harrington Manufacturing. I almost laughed out loud. They were no longer trying to blur the line. They wanted me to erase it myself. I screenshot the relevant contract section, highlighted the language stating that the full architecture, source code, design logic, and operational infrastructure remained my exclusive property, licensed to the company for use only. 6 hours later, Victor replied that the company was moving to internal management immediately and that final payment would be processed under the contract. 2 days after that, their legal department sent me a certified letter accusing me of violating non-disclosure obligations and retaining proprietary systems that belonged to the company. I sat at the same kitchen table reading it and felt something colder than anger. Not fear. Disgust. I opened my file cabinet and pulled out a printed email from Victor's first week as chief executive. In it, he had written to senior leadership that he had reviewed my ownership clause and would work around it during transition. In other words, he had known from day one that the system was not theirs. I scanned that email, attached it to my response, and sent back one line asking them to review internal communications before escalating further. They went silent for almost 2 days. And then that morning, they sent the termination notice. If you have ever watched someone charge ahead while knowing they are wrong because they think title and posture can bend reality, subscribe to the channel. The biggest falls often begin with that kind of confidence. By then, I had no doubt left. Victor did not want cooperation. He did not want clarity. He wanted me gone so he could reach for something that had never belonged to him. As the clock edged toward 9 that morning, I washed out my coffee cup, put on my coat, gathered a few basic documents, and sat still for a minute before leaving for the 10 o'clock meeting. That pause mattered more to me than any speech I could have prepared. I did not need clever lines to win an argument. The legal reality had been on my side long before Victor ever entered the company. What I needed was a cold mind and a steady voice. On the drive to Harrington Manufacturing, I thought about the mornings years earlier when I had arrived there with a completely different purpose. Back then, I came as the person bringing control back into a collapsing operation. This time I was arriving as the contractor. Someone had decided to treat like an inconvenience in a cost reduction plan. The irony was that Victor probably still believed it was a routine administrative meeting. He likely expected me to put a neat stack of documents on the table, accept a few artificial thank yous, and disappear, while the company continued using what he assumed had been fully purchased through monthly payments. That kind of innocence is dangerous. It reveals more than ignorance of a contract. It reveals a deep failure to understand what specialized work actually is. People like Victor believe anything complex can be flattened into diagrams if the right person speaks confidently enough over it. He parked, looked at the reflective glass of the administrative building, and felt unexpectedly calm. Not forgiving. Just settled. The kind of calm that comes when you know exactly where your boundary is and exactly what wall the other person is about to hit. I took one deep breath, stepped out of the car, and promised myself I would not give up another inch. When someone decides pressure will let them take what is yours, the cleanest answer is often not rage. It is letting them meet the consequence of their own decision. I walked into the conference room at exactly 10. Victor was already seated at the head of the polished table, with an open folder in front of him and a red pen laid across the page, like he had just circled a few offensive expense items, and felt very pleased with himself. Off to one side sat Evelyn Pierce from Human Resources, holding her tablet like a shield. Victor did not look up right away. He flipped a page and said in a flat, efficient tone that the company had decided to bring systems management in-house in order to improve efficiency and control costs. I sat down and let him talk. Some people reveal themselves most clearly when they think power is entirely theirs. After a moment, he finally looked at me and said that before the end of the day, he would require full handover of the automation system. All access credentials, source code, documentation, and every technical file necessary for transfer. The room went so quiet I could hear the ventilation above us. I smiled. Not warmly, not mockingly, just with the expression of someone who had already seen this moment coming from the instant the morning email landed. I told him I was afraid I could not do that. He stopped and frowned, like I had said something absurd. Then I explained, slowly and clearly, that the system did not belong to the company. They had paid for operational access, not ownership. Victor shot back immediately that the company had funded development, and therefore the company owned the result. I told him to review the intellectual property section of the service agreement. Evelyn began typing quickly, probably pulling up the contract. But Victor waved her off without even looking. He insisted I could not hold company infrastructure hostage. I told him I was not holding hostage, something they had never owned. I was clarifying what legal control they actually had, and as of roughly 3 minutes earlier, when they terminated my agreement, that control was almost nothing. In the silence after that sentence, I watched the first crack appear in his certainty. I left the room, gave Evelyn a small nod, and walked straight back to my car. The drive home took about 15 minutes, which was long enough for the truth of the situation to settle cleanly into place. Victor had fired me, and then demanded 4 years of custom engineering work his company had never purchased outright. When I parked in my garage, I stayed in the seat for a few more seconds and listened to the engine cool down. In front of me stood the master control cabinet, the object Victor did not even know existed as a real physical command center. From the outside, it was just a large gray steel enclosure. Inside, it was the central nervous system of their entire manufacturing network custom boards, dedicated communication channels, live connections to all 12 sites, 47 production lines, quality systems, inventory tracking, and equipment diagnostics. I opened my laptop, connected to the control layer, and looked at a dashboard that was still perfectly green. Everything was running flawlessly, which was exactly why Victor had fooled himself into believing the system could be transitioned with little effort. People always underestimate what they cannot see. I started building what I privately thought of as his education package. It had to look polished, complete, and convincing enough that anyone without real depth would think they had received everything needed to operate the system. I built clean diagrams, dashboard screenshots, flow maps, and operational explanations at exactly the level required under the license. It took me most of the day to assemble a package that looked comprehensive, while only describing the layer users were allowed to see. No access to the control infrastructure, no command pathway into the core boards, no activation authority. By late afternoon, I emailed the documentation and added one short line: user interface materials provided per termination obligations. Back-end infrastructure access is not included under the licensing agreement. Then I went back out to the garage, rested my hand lightly on the master relay, and waited. I was not feeling triumphant. I was watching the lesson approach. The next morning I drove to Maple Diner exactly the way I did on ordinary days. Same corner booth, same black coffee, same wheat toast. The owner, Owen Blake, recognized me with a kind of quiet familiarity that makes the world feel honest. That simple trust stood in sharp contrast to the executive theater Victor had set in motion. I opened my laptop and checked the remote dashboard. Every indicator was still green. Their internal technology people had probably spent the entire night wrestling with the documentation package I had sent, trying to turn clean diagrams into actual control authority. At 8:47, I decided the illusion had lasted long enough. I reached for the keyboard and disconnected the master relay. On my screen, the data streams froze almost instantly. All the green markers turned gray. The system did not explode, crash, or throw theatrical alarms. I had designed it to separate gracefully, which is often far more dangerous. For the first several minutes, the people inside the plants might not even notice. Their dashboards would still display the last cached values. Machines would continue executing the final instructions already in progress. But the central coordination layer was gone. No live quality feedback. No active lot conflict prevention. No synchronized inventory movement. No health diagnostics across the equipment network. It was like watching a body continue to twitch for a few moments after the nervous system had been severed. I took a slow sip of coffee and opened the integrated security camera feeds. From the outside, the lines looked disturbingly normal. That was the cruelest part. Real disasters rarely begin with noise. Most of the time, they begin with a few quiet minutes that fool the people in charge into thinking control still exists. I sat there in a diner booth, fully aware that the clock had started counting the price of arrogance by a little before 9. The first fractures became visible. On my camera feeds, the stamping line at the main facility was still moving. But the quality sensors were no longer feeding meaningful information back into the central system. There was no automatic rejection logic, no active statistical control. Just mechanical repetition continuing, while nobody could be sure the output still met spec. Less than 20 minutes later, 2 separate sites started processing the same batch number. That alone told me the conflict prevention layer was no longer protecting them. My phone began vibrating with incoming calls from company numbers. I let them roll to voicemail. Then the first email arrived from Marcus Doyle, one of their operations supervisors. His tone was still polite, almost hopeful that this might be a minor glitch. He wrote that quality updates were lagging. The dashboards looked normal, but the floor reports were no longer matching. Marcus was the kind of person I respected. He had enough hands-on experience to know complex systems do not get fixed with blind optimism. But at that point, he was still seeing symptoms rather than the full structure of the failure. More messages followed. Production data, not refreshing. Quality sensors offline at another site. Multiple lines assigned the same batch. Everyone was still using the courteous language of people who believed a competent contractor could fix this with one phone call. I opened the impact model I had written years earlier to estimate the cost of coordination failure across a manufacturing network. Even using conservative assumptions, the number was brutal, roughly $38,000 per hour in lost efficiency and waste. That did not include the possibility of scrapping everything made since the last trusted quality checkpoint. It did not include missed deliveries, compliance exposure, or the most serious risk of all, safety processes drifting out of alignment while human beings were still working in the middle of it. I ordered another coffee and watched the messages keep coming. They still did not understand exactly what they were losing, but they were getting closer by the minute. A little after 10:30, Marcus called my direct line. This time I answered. The second I heard his tight breathing and strained voice, I knew the situation had moved beyond the category of minor technical trouble in their minds. He said the dashboard still looked stable, but the production lines were no longer coordinating. The quality feedback had stopped updating, and the whole network felt like it had gone silent underneath the surface. I let him finish and replied in a calm voice that sounded almost too cold, even to my own ears. It sounded like a significant system failure. Marcus pushed immediately, asking me to remote in and look, because things were deteriorating fast. Then, he mentioned that one facility had just experienced a near miss involving an industrial mixer because safety interlocks were no longer communicating correctly. That made me tighten my grip around the coffee cup. I had built those protections with layered redundancies. But I also knew that frightened people start making manual decisions when they no longer trust automation. I told him I could not help. My agreement had been terminated the morning before. There was a heavy pause on the line while his brain clearly worked through what that actually meant. He asked again, almost in disbelief, whether they had really let me go. I said yes. Marcus then said the thing management should have understood from the beginning, this was my system. And nobody inside the company understood it well enough to run it independently. I answered that I had already provided all documentation required under the contract. He hesitated and then admitted that the material did not actually control anything. I did not disagree. I simply told him that was exactly what Victor had requested. Another silence followed. Then Marcus lowered his voice and stopped sounding like an employee calling a vendor. He sounded like a man trying to protect the people around him. He said there were more than 800 workers in those facilities, and if the safety layers were drifting, this was no longer about corporate politics. He was right. But another truth mattered too. The moment they terminated my access, they made a decision to own the consequences that came with it. I told him he needed to speak to Victor or Lucas Bennett in information technology. He hung up without saying goodbye. I did not blame him. He was the only person in that story calling for the right reason. After the call with Marcus, the whole situation accelerated so fast, it was almost visible. My phone kept ringing from different company numbers. Text messages started arriving. Then, an urgent email with red flags appeared from Lucas Bennett, the information technology director. This message had stripped away most of the corporate polish. It openly acknowledged severe failure across the facility network, operational conflicts, missing control responses, compromised safety protocols, and rising risk to compliance and customer commitments. I read the message slowly. Not because I enjoyed their panic, but because I wanted to be certain they had finally begun to name the problem honestly. There is something revealing about the moment. A company that treats technical work like an outside service is forced to admit its core infrastructure is collapsing in real time. That is usually when reality begins to educate them. I opened a new document and drafted an emergency restoration proposal. The rate was 2.5 times my normal monthly fee for immediate reactivation during business hours. Payment by wire transfer had to be completed before I would restore the system. The emergency window would run for 96 hours. The terms required full acknowledgement of the existing service agreement and explicit recognition of my intellectual property ownership over the system. I sent the proposal simultaneously to Victor, Lucas, and Marcus with a subject line that was almost clinical emergency restoration services available. It was not revenge. It was a rational price for risk, responsibility, time, and the damage they had chosen to create by handling a critical relationship in the dumbest possible way. In industrial manufacturing, every hour of chaos has a very real cost. Raw material is wasted. Quality checkpoints lose value. Delivery schedules collapse. Entire teams are forced into emergency behavior. I knew that if even a few people in upper management were capable of simple arithmetic, they would see immediately that my proposal was far cheaper than continuing to watch their own operation grind itself apart. I sent the email, leaned back, and waited. Before long, they would have to choose between Victor's ego and the reality on the plant floor. The video meeting invitation arrived early in the afternoon, all in capital letters as if typography could repair what had already been broken. I joined a few minutes early from my home office with my engineering certificates visible on the wall behind me. Not as a performance, but because I had nothing to hide. One face after another filled the screen. Warren Hayes, some senior vice president, appeared first with his sleeves rolled up, and the look of a man who had already survived several emergency meetings without yet understanding how an ordinary cost-cutting action had become a company-level crisis. Two lawyers joined next. One, taking frantic notes, and the other, reviewing documents on a second monitor. Marcus looked exhausted. Victor sat in a smaller window, lower on the screen. Microphone muted. Body language, suggesting he was no longer allowed to lead the disaster he had created. Warren opened in a carefully controlled tone, saying they were dealing with a major operational disruption and needed to understand their options for immediate restoration. I answered simply that my service agreement had been terminated the previous morning, and if they wanted operational access restored, all relevant terms were already in the emergency proposal. One of the attorneys leaned forward and said the financial terms seemed disproportionate to the circumstances. I told her those were standard emergency response terms for critical infrastructure during active business hours. Marcus finally cut through the posturing. He said they had 12 facilities nearly paralyzed. Quality violations stacking up by the hour. Labor safety authorities beginning to ask questions. And major customers threatening contract termination if normal operations were not restored by the next morning. Warren tried a softer tactic and said there may have been a misunderstanding during transition and that they wanted to focus on solutions. I made it plain full wire transfer. Confirmed payment. Then reactivation. At that point, Victor unmuted himself and accused me of extortion, saying I was holding the company hostage over a contract dispute. I looked directly into the camera and told him he had terminated my services and demanded access to infrastructure the company had never purchased. I had provided exactly what the contract entitled them to receive. Nothing more. Nothing less. After that, Warren asked for 15 minutes to discuss matters internally, and the call went dark on their side. While the screen sat idle, I checked my email. My proposal had already been forwarded through finance, legal, operations, risk, and probably even their insurance chain. That told me something important. They were no longer arguing about principles. They were calculating pain by the hour. I did not need to speculate much. Even the most conservative estimate of downtime and waste made my emergency fee the cheapest path left. 18 minutes later, they returned. Warren's face had changed. The managerial confidence was gone. What remained was the resigned look of a man who had finally realized he had been holding a losing hand from the start. He said legal was initiating the wire transfer and expected completion within the hour. I told him that once the money hit my account, I would begin. The silence that followed was uncomfortable enough to be almost physical. Nobody wanted to say aloud that a polished cost optimization decision had just turned into one of the most expensive mornings in the company's recent history. I closed my laptop and walked out into the diner parking lot to get some air while waiting for payment. The afternoon was cool. Leaves moving lightly in the breeze. The outside world, continuing as if nothing unusual had happened. Meanwhile, inside Harrington Manufacturing. People were learning a lesson that could have been avoided simply by reading a contract with respect. About half an hour later, my bank notification came through. Wire received. Amount correct. No delay. I looked at the screen for a few seconds and then called Warren back. I told him payment was confirmed and I was starting restoration. He asked how long it would take. I said roughly 45 minutes. Maybe less if the data inconsistencies had not spread too far. I left the diner and drove home quickly but carefully. I did not feel victorious. I felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling back onto my shoulders. Unlike Victor, I understood that restoring a distributed automation network is not a matter of flipping one switch and walking away. When coordination is severed for hours, the damage is not only the silence, it is in misaligned data, half-finished production states, and the manual decisions frightened people are forced to make while the structure around them is unstable. Back in my garage, I sat down in front of the master control cabinet and began the restoration sequence exactly the way I had designed it for worst-case scenarios. Reconnection could not happen all at once. 4 hours of disruption had already created enough inconsistency that every major subsystem had to be verified manually. Some lines were halfway through active production runs. Some quality checkpoints had missing intervals and needed a trusted baseline re-established. Inventory records had drifted because materials had continued moving while central coordination was offline. I checked each branch of communication, validated each subsystem, and reintroduced feedback loops in the correct order so one facility would not poison another with bad state data. Years in this field have a way of teaching your hands the rhythm of recovery before your mind finishes, naming every step. Warren sent a few short emails asking for updates while I worked, but I ignored them until I had something real to say. On infrastructure like this, reassurance delivered 5 minutes too early can be more dangerous than silence. I do not believe in green indicators until I have personally verified the layers beneath them. 28 minutes after I started, every major status light on the control panel was stable again. All 12 facilities were fully reconnected. All 47 lines were synchronized. Quality data was flowing. Inventory was aligned. Safety logic was responding correctly. I called Warren and told him the system had been restored and full operational status was confirmed. He thanked me for the rapid response. I told him I had not acted out of goodwill or speed. I had acted according to the terms they had accepted. Then I ended the call before he could add anything. For the next week, I monitored the whole network from my kitchen table. The irony was that the numbers after restoration looked even better than before. Those 4 hours of chaos had revealed a few small inefficiencies I was able to correct while cleaning up the recovery state. Quality returned to perfect. Safety protocols held. No new customer complaints came in. And management from the company stayed completely silent. That silence was not ingratitude. It was the sound of an organization trying to live with the embarrassment of finally understanding how foolish it had been. Exactly 1 week after Victor's termination email, a new message landed in my inbox from someone else entirely, Natalie Cross, Vice President of Strategic Operations. The fact that her name appeared instead of Victor's said enough on its own. The company clearly wanted to manage the aftermath without letting the person who caused it touch the process again. The subject line was professional. The tone, respectful, and the proposal inside was nothing like the arrogance that had come before. They offered a 3-year exclusive agreement at a significantly higher rate. Explicit recognition of my intellectual property rights. Formal protection against future internal transition attempts. And priority consideration for expansion work. The clause that caught my attention most was one I had never seen in the earlier contract. Harrington Manufacturing now explicitly acknowledged that Diana Mercer's automation systems were proprietary technology licensed solely for operational use, and that any attempt to reverse engineer, duplicate, or claim ownership of those systems would trigger immediate termination and financial penalties equal to 24 months of service fees. In other words, Victor had taught them how precise fear can make contract language. I read the draft twice, and then spent an hour tightening it further. I added a 90-day written notice requirement for any management change affecting the relationship. I narrowed access to core technical materials. I strengthened dispute handling and clarified the exact boundaries of the licensed infrastructure. 2 weeks later, the signed version arrived by courier with every revision intact. No softened language. No corporate hedging. Victor's name was nowhere on it. I never learned precisely what happened to him afterward. But manufacturing circles are small, and stories move fast. The tale of a polished executive who tried to seize a custom automation system and cost his company a fortune in a single morning was more than enough to follow him wherever he went. For me, that contract was not only a better deal, it was a written admission from an entire organization that real value does not live in titles. It lives in the person who understands and builds the thing, keeping the business alive. Less than a month after the incident, my phone started ringing in a very different way. Companies from multiple states began asking versions of the same question. Was I available for systems development work? They had heard about Harrington Manufacturing. They had heard about the collapse, the emergency restoration fee, and the fact that a large company had been forced to come back and sign a stronger agreement with the woman they thought they could eliminate. Some stories are worth more than any advertising campaign. And this was one of them. I raised my rates by roughly a third. Nobody complained. Every new client signed contracts with ownership clauses tight enough to make their lawyers pause and read carefully. But they signed anyway. Not because I bullied them, because they understood what happens when the creator of critical infrastructure fails to protect her work. Or when the customer mistakes licensed access for the right to take possession. 3 years later, I am overseeing systems across 47 manufacturing facilities in 8 states. My monthly revenue is well beyond what I ever earned while working for someone else. I have 2 younger engineers working with me now, and I am teaching them not only how to build durable systems, but also how to write agreements that nobody can twist after the fact. Samuel Whitmore, the man who first called me years ago, still sends me a Christmas card every year from Florida. In the most recent one, he wrote that he had always known I would land on my feet, and that some people only learn after paying dearly for their arrogance. I think he was right. If my story means anything, it is this: if you build something valuable, do not wait until someone tries to take it before you start protecting it. Read every clause. Understand every ownership boundary. Remember the difference between licensing use and surrendering creation. And when someone full of confidence but empty of real experience tries to lecture you about managing the very thing you built, sometimes the fairest response is to smile. Step back and let reality teach on your behalf. That system is still running perfectly. Even now, no serious failures, no safety violations, nothing magical about it. Just the simple truth that when something is built correctly, maintained by the right hands, and protected by the right boundaries, it keeps doing exactly what it was meant to do.